To understand why 5 frozen men stood on that desolate coast in 1931 and declared war on Denmark with nothing but a flag and their frostbitten courage, we need to travel back in time. We need to go back more than 1,000 years, to an age when the North Atlantic was not a barrier but a highway, when dragon-headed ships carved through icy waves, and when the name Greenland was first spoken by a man with blood on his hands and dreams of a new world in his heart. The year was 982 AD, and in the volcanic landscapes of Iceland, a man named Erik Thorvaldsson was in serious trouble. Erik was not a peaceful farmer or a quiet merchant. He was a warrior, a killer, and a man whose temper burned hotter than the geysers that dotted the Icelandic countryside. Erik had gotten into a dispute with a neighbor over some borrowed property, and in typical Viking fashion, the dispute had escalated from words to violence. By the time the dust settled, several men were dead, and Erik was declared an outlaw. In Viking society, being outlawed was a death sentence. It meant you had no legal protection. Anyone could kill you without consequence. Erik had 3 years to leave Iceland or die. But Erik Thorvaldsson was not the kind of man who accepted defeat. He was not the kind of man who slunk away into exile with his tail between his legs. Erik looked west, toward the horizon, toward the stories sailors told of a massive island of ice that lay beyond the edge of the known world. Ships had glimpsed it before, shrouded in fog and surrounded by treacherous icebergs, but no one had dared to settle there. Erik decided he would be the first. He loaded his family, his livestock, and a handful of loyal followers onto a sturdy Viking longship, and he sailed into the unknown. What Erik found was a land of staggering contrasts. Yes, there were glaciers that stretched as far as the eye could see, rivers of ice that groaned and cracked as they slowly crushed the mountains beneath them. Yes, there were winters so dark and cold that they seemed to swallow the soul. But there were also fjords, deep channels carved by ancient ice, where the water was calm and rich with fish. There were valleys where grass grew thick in the brief summer, perfect for grazing sheep and cattle. There were seals and whales and polar bears, resources that could sustain a colony if you were tough enough to take them. Erik spent 3 years exploring this new land. He mapped the coastline, he found the best harbors, and he chose the locations where settlements could thrive. And then, when his exile was over, Erik returned to Iceland not as a broken man, but as a visionary. He told tales of a fertile paradise waiting to be claimed, a land so rich and green that it made Iceland look barren. He called it Greenland, a marketing genius even by modern standards, because who would want to move to a place called Iceland when you could go to Greenland? It was the first real estate scam in history, and it worked brilliantly. In 985, Erik led a fleet of 25 ships filled with colonists back to Greenland. Only 14 ships made it through the brutal crossing. But those who survived established 2 major settlements on the southwestern coast. They built farms, they built churches, and they built a society. These were not just random adventurers. These were Norsemen, people from Norway and its sphere of influence. They spoke Old Norse. They worshipped the Norse gods, and later, after Christianization, they built stone churches that still stand today as testament to their determination. And most importantly, they paid taxes to the King of Norway. Greenland was not independent. It was a colony, a possession of the Norwegian crown. For nearly 500 years, Norse Greenlanders thrived. They traded walrus ivory and polar bear furs back to Europe. They hunted seals and whales. They raised sheep and cattle. Archaeological evidence shows they even traveled as far as the Canadian Arctic, making contact with the indigenous Inuit people whom they called Skrælings. The Norse Greenlanders were the westernmost outpost of European civilization, and they were proud subjects of Norway. When the Norwegian king commanded, they obeyed. When Norwegian ships arrived, they paid their tribute. Greenland was Norwegian in every sense that mattered in medieval times. But then came the catastrophe. In the 14th century, a plague swept across Europe like the hand of God striking down the sinful. The Black Death, carried by fleas on rats aboard merchant ships, killed somewhere between 75 and 200 million people. Entire villages were wiped out. Cities became graveyards. And Norway, isolated and sparsely populated, was hit particularly hard. Some estimates suggest that nearly 60% of Norway's population died in the plague years. The kingdom was devastated. The economy collapsed. the government barely functioned. Norway, once a proud sea power with colonies across the Atlantic, was brought to its knees. In its weakened state, Norway could not stand alone. In 1397, Norway entered into a political union with Denmark and Sweden, called the Kalmar Union. It was supposed to be a partnership of equals. 3 kingdoms under one crown, but in reality, Denmark, with its larger population and wealthier economy, dominated the arrangement. The capital was in Copenhagen. The king was Danish. And slowly, year by year, Norway became less of a partner and more of a province. Norwegian nobles were replaced with Danish administrators. Norwegian laws were overridden by Danish decrees. The Norwegian language itself began to be suppressed in official documents, replaced by Danish. Norway was being absorbed, digested, erased. With Norway went its colonies. Greenland, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, all of these North Atlantic possessions that had been settled by Norwegians, governed by Norwegian laws, and tied to the Norwegian crown for centuries, were now administered from Copenhagen. To the Danes, it was a simple administrative matter. To the Norwegians, it was theft, but they were powerless to stop it. The Kalmar Union lasted until 1523, when Sweden broke away, but Norway remained shackled to Denmark for nearly 3 more centuries. It was a period Norwegians would later call the 400 Years of Night, a time when their nation existed in name only, a shadow without substance. Then came the Napoleonic Wars, and with them, the final betrayal. By the early 1800s, Europe was consumed by the conflict between Napoleon's France and the various coalitions assembled to stop him. Denmark, hoping to protect its trade routes and maintain its neutrality, found itself in an impossible position. In 1807, fearing that Denmark's substantial navy would fall into Napoleon's hands, Britain launched a preemptive strike. The British fleet bombarded Copenhagen for 4 days, killing thousands of civilians and destroying much of the city. Denmark, furious and humiliated, allied with Napoleon. It was a fatal mistake. By 1814, Napoleon's empire was crumbling. The Allied powers of Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria were closing in on Paris. Denmark, as a French ally, was on the losing side, and the victors demanded payment. The Treaty of Kiel, signed on January 14, 1814, was designed to punish Denmark and reward Sweden, which had fought against Napoleon. The treaty's main provision was simple and brutal. Denmark would cede the Kingdom of Norway to the King of Sweden. For Norway, this should have been a moment of liberation. After 400 years under Danish rule, they were finally being released. But the treaty contained a clause, buried in the legal language, that would haunt Norway for more than a century. Article 4 of the Treaty of Kiel specified that, while the Kingdom of Norway was being transferred to Sweden, the dependencies of Norway, specifically Greenland, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands, would remain with Denmark.
I'll
Read that again. The dependencies of Norway would remain with Denmark. Not the dependencies of Denmark. The dependencies of Norway. The treaty itself acknowledged that these territories belonged to Norway, and in the same breath, it stripped them away. It was as if someone had stolen your car, and then when forced to return it, kept the wheels because they liked them. The Norwegian negotiators protested. They argued that Greenland had been discovered by Norwegians, settled by Norwegians, and had been in Norwegian possession for 8 centuries. They argued that separating the colonies from the kingdom made no legal or historical sense. But the great powers did not care about Norwegian feelings. They cared about maintaining the balance of power in Europe. Denmark had lost Norway, its largest and most important territory. Letting Denmark keep Greenland, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands was a consolation prize, a way to prevent the Danish monarchy from collapsing entirely. Sweden, the victor, did not care about frozen rocks in the North Atlantic. They wanted the timber, the iron, and the manpower of mainland Norway. And so, the clause stood. When the treaty was signed, Norway lost its colonies forever, or so it seemed. The sense of betrayal among Norwegians was profound and lasting. Imagine spending 800 years building something, pouring your blood and sweat into a distant land, sending your sons and daughters there, burying your ancestors in its soil, and then having it taken away by the stroke of a pen signed by men who had never set foot on its shores. That was how Norwegians felt about Greenland. It was not just about territory or resources. It was about identity. It was about history. It was about the fundamental question of who they were as a people. Throughout the 19th century, as Norway struggled under yet another foreign yoke, this time Swedish, the loss of Greenland festered like an infected wound. School children learned about Erik the Red and the brave Norse settlers who had tamed the Arctic. Historians published thick volumes arguing that the Treaty of Kiel had been illegal, that Denmark had no legitimate claim to Greenland. But poetry and history books do not change borders. Norway remained powerless. Then, in 1905, something remarkable happened. Norway finally achieved full independence. The union with Sweden was dissolved peacefully through negotiation and a national referendum. For the first time since the 14th century, Norway was a sovereign nation, master of its own destiny. The joy was immense, but it was tinged with sadness. Because while Norway was finally free, Greenland, Iceland, and the Faroes remained under Danish control. The wound was still open. The theft was still unresolved. A new generation of Norwegians grew up in this independent nation, and they looked at the map with fresh eyes. They looked at Greenland and saw something their parents and grandparents had not been strong enough to reclaim. They saw an opportunity. Because while Denmark held Greenland legally, they did not hold it practically. Denmark's population and government were concentrated on the west coast of Greenland, where the capital Nuuk was located and where the Inuit population lived. But the east coast, thousands of miles of coastline facing the Norwegian Sea, was almost completely empty. There were no Danish towns there, no Danish police, no Danish administrators. It was a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. Norwegian hunters and trappers, tough men who made their living from the sea, began to venture into this empty space. At first they went for the same reasons Erik the Red had gone, for opportunity, for resources, for adventure. The Arctic fox pelts from East Greenland fetched high prices in European markets. The seals and polar bears provided meat, oil, and skins. It was dangerous work, the kind of work that killed more men than it enriched. But for those who succeeded, it was a way to make a fortune. And slowly, year by year, these Norwegian trappers began to establish a presence. They built hunting cabins. They gave Norwegian names to the fjords and mountains. They planted Norwegian flags over their camps, not as political statements, but as markers, as declarations that we are here. By the 1920s, dozens of Norwegian hunters were spending winters in East Greenland. They formed a community, a rough brotherhood of men who knew each other S-boats and traded stories in the long, dark months when the sun did not rise. They began to see themselves not just as visitors, but as residents, as rightful occupants of a land their ancestors had discovered. And they began to ask a dangerous question. If Denmark is not here, if Denmark is not using this land, if Denmark is not governing this land, then does Denmark really own it? This question was not just philosophical. It had a legal dimension rooted in a concept called terra nullius, which is Latin for nobody's land, according to international law as it was understood at the time. Particularly in the wake of the colonial scrambles for Africa and the Pacific, ownership of territory required effective occupation. It was not enough to draw a line on a map and say, "This is mine." You had to actually be there, had to govern, to administer, to exert authority. And if you did not, then the land was legally up for grabs. The Norwegian trappers began to argue in the pubs of Tromsø and the meeting halls of Oslo that East Greenland was terra nullius. It was nobody's land. And if it was nobody's land, then it could become Norway's land. The Danish government watched this growing Norwegian presence with increasing alarm. They saw the writing on the wall. If they did not act, they risked losing Greenland piece by piece, fjord by fjord, to de facto Norwegian occupation. In 1930, Denmark made a fateful decision. They announced a new policy. All of Greenland was now a closed territory. Foreign ships, including Norwegian ships, needed special permits to land. Foreign nationals, including Norwegian trappers, were forbidden from establishing permanent stations without Danish permission. It was a clear message. Greenland is ours, all of it, and we are taking control. The reaction in Norway was explosive. The trappers felt they were being expelled from land they had rightfully claimed. Nationalist politicians seized on the issue, arguing that Denmark was once again stealing from Norway. The press fanned the flames with editorials about Viking heritage and national honor. And in the government, men like Vidkun Quisling began to whisper that perhaps it was time for Norway to stop asking for permission and start taking action. The stage was set for confrontation. The flag at Mosquito Bay was not a random act of rebellion. It was the culmination of 1,000 years of history, 400 years of humiliation, and a century of festering resentment. When Halvor Duvald raised that flag in June 1931, he was not just planting a piece of cloth in the ground, he was planting a declaration that the theft of 1814 would not stand. He was saying that Norway remembered. He was saying that the North Atlantic belonged to the heirs of the Vikings, not to administrators in Copenhagen who had never felt the bite of Arctic wind or heard the crack of breaking ice. And the world was about to find out whether the age of empires and conquest was truly over, or whether one last territorial struggle would be decided not by who was strongest, but by who had the better lawyers. Instead of sending warships, the world held its breath to see if this new experiment in international law could actually work. The case went to the Permanent Court of International Justice at The Hague, where 15 judges from around the world would decide the fate of the Arctic. Denmark assembled a brilliant legal team and began the painstaking work of proving their case. They gathered evidence of Danish scientific expeditions to East Greenland, trade monopolies that covered the entire island, and treaties where other nations had recognized Danish sovereignty over all of Greenland. Norway's lawyers countered with maps showing the vast empty spaces and testimony from trappers who had lived in East Greenland for years without seeing a single Danish official. The Norwegian team was confident that their logic would prevail. How could Denmark own land they never used or governed? But then Denmark revealed their secret weapon. Hidden in the archives, they had found a memorandum from 1919, recording a conversation between the Danish foreign minister and his Norwegian counterpart, Niels Claes Ihlen. At a diplomatic gathering, Ihlen had been asked if Norway would object to Denmark extending sovereignty over all of Greenland. According to the Danish record, Ihlen had replied that Norway would not make any difficulties. It was called the Ihlen Declaration, and it was devastating. In international law, when a foreign minister speaks, he speaks for his nation. Norway had already promised not to contest Danish sovereignty over Greenland, and now they were trying to take it anyway. The Norwegian legal team scrambled to argue that Ihlen had been speaking informally, that a casual remark could not constitute a binding commitment, but the damage was done. On April 5, 1933, the judges delivered their verdict. By a vote of 12-2, they ruled in favor of Denmark. The court found that Denmark had sufficiently demonstrated sovereignty through consistent administrative acts and international recognition. They found that the Ihlen Declaration was binding, and that Norway was legally prevented from claiming territory it had previously acknowledged as Danish. The Norwegian occupation was declared illegal. When the news reached Oslo, the reaction was one of stunned silence followed by bitter anger. It felt like the betrayal of 1814 all over again. But then something remarkable happened that speaks to the character of the Norwegian people. Despite the public outrage, despite the sense of historical injustice, the Norwegian government accepted the verdict. They ordered Halvor Duvald and his men to lower the flag at Mosquito Bay and come home. Imagine that moment in the Arctic. Duvald and his crew, who had endured the brutal winter believing they were heroes reclaiming stolen land, received the radio message that their occupation was over. They walked out into the frozen wind, and with tears freezing on their faces, they lowered the Norwegian flag. They packed their equipment, closed up their cabin, and sailed away from East Greenland. They did not sabotage anything. They did not resist. They simply accepted that the court had spoken and the matter was settled. In Copenhagen there was celebration, but also relief. Denmark had won, but more importantly, they had proven that territorial disputes could be resolved without war. The case set a precedent that echoes to this day in international law, establishing that sovereignty in remote regions does not require constant physical occupation. It's only consistent administrative intent and international recognition. The legacy of this strange conflict is profound. It was the first time in human history that an entire territory was won not on a battlefield but in a courtroom. It proved that the new international order created after World War I could actually function. That small nations could defend themselves through law rather than military might. The Ihlen Declaration became a landmark in diplomatic history, a cautionary tale about the weight of words spoken by government officials. And for Norway and Denmark, two nations that could have gone to war over frozen rocks, the peaceful resolution actually strengthened their relationship. The wound of Greenland slowly healed. Today, Norway and Denmark are close allies and friends. Their dispute over the Arctic, a distant memory. The flag that Halvard Duvald planted at Mosquito Bay flew for less than 2 years, but its impact lasted forever. It forced the world to answer a fundamental question about how nations should behave in the modern age. And the answer, delivered by those 15 judges in The Hague, was clear. The age of conquest was over. From that day forward, borders would be determined not by who was strongest, but by who had the best argument, the strongest evidence, and the most respect for the rule of law. It was a victory not just for Denmark, but for civilization itself. History moved you. Hit that like button and subscribe for more.